Okay. Good evening. Would like to welcome you this evening to our presentation by Dr. Jane Ashby. Let me introduce you to Dr. Ashby. She is a researcher in the cognitive processes that support eye movements and underlie the reading process. She is located at Central Michigan University. And more importantly, I consider Dr. Ashby a friend and just a gem the state of Michigan is lucky to have. Not only is she a colleague and a friend to the Reading League Michigan, but to educators as a whole. She has a passion for students and instruction and education in general and the practices. And what I find most endearing, I think, about Jane is that besides the fact that she's really interested in educators, she works with students regularly. So she is connected to practice and outcomes and the research, which is just a wonderful skill set and again, an asset. And we welcome you and thank you for this evening.
Well, thank you, Rebecca. Thank you all for being here. This is such a pleasure. This is really great. So I'm looking forward to this opportunity. What we're going to do is we're going to wade in slowly into stuff about the eyes and brain. I don't want anybody to go into shock. I don't want any panic. All right. And then we're going to slowly ramp up and wade in a little bit deeper and all the way try to connect what we're learning to what you are doing in the classroom and with your students. All right. So thanks, Rebecca, for that lovely introduction. Yes, I am a reading teacher and a reading practitioner. So I work with dyslexic students in addition to working in my job at the psychology department where I generate reading research. I won't be talking with you tonight about my research. One of the things I like to do is use my research expertise to try to pull all those pesky papers together and translate them into language that people can understand. And so I really see that as my forte. So that's what I'll be trying to do tonight. So we're going to start with, let me just mention that I got my start in Boston, working at an alternative high school, trying to do writing process with students who I found were reading at about the 4th grade level. And that sort of shaped the beginning of my career and everything that followed, because I had no idea there were such a thing as reading problems before I started there. Who knew that this was an issue for kids, right? And that was like the beginning of that world. And that was about 30 years ago. So I've learned a little bit since then. And one of the things that I've learned is that we all, I think it's tough to be an educator and not rely on your intuition, right? So I personally rely on my intuition a lot when I'm working one-on-one with kids, right? How much can you ask them to do? When have they had enough practice? It's always good to quantify, right? To try to back up that intuition. But I personally use my intuitions a lot when I'm working one-on-one. So I think it's important that before we go beyond intuition, we take a moment just to recognize how intuition contributes to our practice. All right, so I'd like you to just think for a minute, type in the chat some adjectives that describe how intuitions work in your practice. Like, what do you think about intuition when you're teaching? How is it useful to you? So we'll give you just a couple minutes to think of maybe some adjectives that describe the role that intuition plays. It could be in your teaching, or it could be broader than that. What role does intuition play in your life and in your communications with other people? I know it's asking a lot for 7 o'clock on a Wednesday. I get it. I get it. So we'll see. Rebecca's going to share with me if she sees some things in the chat. We'll give it another minute. And then I'm prepared for this eventuality. So if we don't, what do we get?
We have quite a bit here. We have adjustment to the teaching, safety, helps adjustment, guiding, adding intention, helps me get to know when a student gets it. I rely on my gut a lot, varying the scaffolding, the prompting supports, feelings and experience differentiation, causes me to ask more questions about needs, helps me know where to begin, adjustments to my teaching, supports differentiation, identifying ZPD, curiosity.
Okay,
feedback.
good. So what I'm hearing is this theme. So it's broader than this, but there's a strong theme there that we use intuition to somehow match the instruction to the student, right? To get in that zone of proximal development, right? So it's not too hard, it's not too easy, right? And that is exactly right. And do you remember what your intuition was when you started teaching? My intuitive sense when I personally started teaching was like nil. It was the inverse of effective, right? It's only as you accrue those experiences, you do that learning, right? And then that somehow, our brains are amazing, right? It gets automatized, it somehow gets stored in there and we can access it so easily. Okay, so that is a great little review of what makes intuitions useful. And so to add to that, I just came up with a few terms. So they're really accessible to us, right? They feel very comfortable and natural, and they can be super useful. The point I'm going to make is that intuitions can be great for certain things, and they're not so great for other things. So let's look at the flip side, okay? Because intuitions by definition are based on previous knowledge, okay, they keep us where we are, okay? They keep us in that same space, and sometimes they can be deceptive. Have you ever had an intuition that turned out to be quite wrong, right? They can be really difficult to displace. Sometimes our intuitions are so strong and it's very hard to work beyond them, right? And in that sense, they can sometimes be disabling, okay? So what we want to do is we want to keep our intuitions and value that way of assessing and communicating and teaching students. And we also want to try to get beyond our intuitions so we can learn some new information. And the reason why we need to learn new information is because intuition is great interpersonally, but it can lead us astray when we try to understand complex systems. Because a lot of times, complex systems are non-intuitive. Okay. And in fact, right now, you're thinking, it's 7 o'clock. What does she mean by a complex system? Okay, you are in the non-intuitive zone. Okay, so let's see what we can do here to make this a little bit more concrete. Here are some intuitions that we've had about complex systems that have held for years. Okay, hundreds of years, people thought the sun orbits the earth. We see the sun rise every morning. We see it set every night. Of course, it goes around the earth until Copernicus, right? We thought that solid objects are solid, that they're one mass. Depending on what you know about the brain and perception, people often think that visual perception begins in the front of the brain. That's where the eyes are, right? So isn't that where it begins in the brain? And other people think that whole word memorization is key to skilled reading. because our experience as skilled readers is that those words just leap right up off the page. Okay, so these are some intuitions that we've had. And then we learn, and our intuition is displaced by these unexpected facts. Okay, like, what do you know? Actually, it's the Earth that goes around the sun. Who would have thought? Okay, solid objects are not solid. They're made up of densely packed molecules. They're made up of these little bits. Visual perception actually begins in the back of the brain. So the information travels from the eyes all the way to the very, very back of the brain, and then is processed moving forward. Nobody would have thought of that, right? That's completely counterintuitive. And what do you know? It's not whole word memorization, but efficient decoding that seems to be the key to building independent, confident readers. So these are all unexpected things that at first, when people discovered that the Earth orbits the sun, there was a lot of discomfort. Okay. It's very unsettling things because intuitions are so strong, it can be difficult to get beyond them. So here are a few intuitions about reading that do not seem to be supported by the reading science that we have right now. And because they're not supported by reading science, I'm not going to read them. I'll just let you read them. You might have some of these intuitions already. If you do, make a note, and maybe we'll talk about it at the end, why these are not supported by reading science. So what do I mean when I talk about the science of reading? All right, so everybody means something different, so I thought I would lay it out there. All right, for me personally, the science of reading, the most important thing about it is that it's a large literature where people conducted all different studies using different methods, and they found similar things. We call that convergent findings. Okay, so it's a large literature of convergent findings about reading processes and reading development. And the reading science can be the systematic observations. Each one of those studies is a process of data collection, right? It's very systematic, it's very quantitative. And when you see the data that you get back from those experiments, all of a sudden, like a curtain, our intuitions about reading are pulled back, and we can see how reading actually develops in children. So I've been playing with different metaphors for this, but I think this is my favorite one, the lowly onion. Okay, the lowly onion, you go into the grocery store, you look at that thing, you're like, what is that? It's like paper on the outside, it is brown, how is that going to be? And yet the onion, that's the cornerstone of French cooking. All right, the beautiful onion. So it's a matter of peeling back what your immediate reaction is to see, look, what everybody has found out about how reading actually works. And that is a very lovely thing. And once we have a science of reading, then you can also have a body of applied knowledge that is going to be consistent with that research literature. And that body of applied knowledge helps identify struggling readers and helps teach them effectively. All right, so I wanted to focus us on two key questions for tonight, all right? And they're pretty straightforward. One is, why do struggling readers struggle? And then the other one is a little bit deeper. What do the differences in brain activity and eye movements between skilled and struggling readers? What do those differences tell us about how to focus instruction? And we're going to start with the eye movements piece, because that's the funnest one and it's the easiest to understand. Okay. But before we get there, let's take a minute and think about intuitions about poor reading. All right, so I'd just like you to jot down. You could answer one question or the other. What are your intuitions about why children who struggle with decoding have problems with comprehension? Now, if you know a lot about the science of reading, your intuition might be right in line with that. If you don't, you might have a very different understanding of why those kids struggle with comprehension. And then the other question is, why do some children read so slowly? Right? It's kind of a puzzle. I don't know about you, but when I started working with struggling readers, and they're reading silently, you're like, what are you doing all that time that your face is in that book? Are you making a Christmas list? Are you thinking about lunch? What are you doing? And yet you see them and they're very focused on what they're doing, but you're not quite sure what is going on in their head, right? Then if you ask them to read aloud, you get a bit of an idea of what is going on in their head, right? So let's think about those intuitions. And then if you would just set that aside, and then we'll come back to that at the end. It would be fun to kind of hear what some of your intuitions are. So those intuitions that you have are based on your existing knowledge. It's based on what you've learned and what you observe, which is why those of us who have the opportunity to work with children in small groups or one-on-one, it's such a powerful thing for our pedagogy, right? To be able to do those close observations with those students. So we're going to try to extend these intuitions a little bit. And let's start by looking at the eye movements of proficient and struggling readers. Okay. This little clip that I have happens to be of adult readers, but it's the same thing for children when they're reading. All right, it's not any different. So I'm going to show you a little movie. Okay, first we're going to see the proficient readers, then we'll see a struggling reader. And it's an eye movement recording of somebody reading silently. Okay, and you're going to see red circles and red sticks. Okay, so the red circles are where the eye stops, okay, in order to recognize words. The size of the circle, if it's like this big or if it's like this big, is how long they stop for. So if they don't stop for very long, it's going to be a small circle. If they stop for a long time, it's going to be a really big circle. Okay. Then the sticks are the saccades. Those are the eye movements from one place to another. Okay, so the eye can move forward in the text or it can move back. Okay, so while you're watching this, just kind of think about, the number of fixations, what they look like. Are the circles really big? Are they really small? Are they kind of all over the place? The direction of movement. And I'm going to pause it in between the proficient reader and the struggling reader, so you can make a couple notes, okay? All right, any questions before I start? Are we good to go, Rebecca? Okay.
We are good.
I'm going to pause it for just a second. Did you see how that reader launched into the passage and then it regressed right back to the beginning? It was like they were expecting something easier and then they let it go, uh-oh, this is going to be tough. I'm going to go back and I'm going to slow down. So that's the self-monitoring that good readers do, right? Like, oh, this is going to be tough. I'm going to go back and reread. Okay, now I'll be quiet for the rest of it. Oh, okay. All right, so I'm just going to move this along here. Here we go. I think it's like right about here. Let's see. Yeah, okay. All right. So make a note about what you saw. There we go. There it is. Okay. All right. So now we're going to watch our low level reader. Sorry about that. So what did we see in that first line? In that first line, we saw many long fixations on each one of those words: expectation, right? Central, satisfaction, very long fixations. And then going back to the beginning, and then much smaller fixations, much shorter fixations on those words, right? Because they knew what they were. All right. This will get a little uncomfortable. Working so hard. Working so hard. So think about, what is the struggle here? And then we're going to do the reread just in case. Okay. All right. So what you're seeing here is that their reading speed is limited by this very slow and inaccurate word recognition, right? Let's talk a little bit about what you saw. How did the fixations look for the high-level reader versus the low-level reader? How did the fixations look for the high-level reader? For the low-level reader, we saw some small dots and we saw some really long ones, right? So you saw a lot of variability. What about the high-level readers? What did you see there? Maybe someone will type in the chat.
We have from Caitlin, the high-level reader had shorter fixations. We have more evenly spaced and consistent. The high level were accurate, automatic, and low level, slow and long time on words and regressed a lot. And then another person, the high level reader, had shorter fixations and mostly on the larger words.
Okay, all right, good. So very, very nice. Yes, those are all true. So they had, the high level reader had shorter fixations. They had more similar fixations. They tend to move forward in the text. They did not regress as much. When the high level reader had big fixations, it was at the end of the sentence or at the end of the paragraph. And we call that the wrap-up effect. That's when the eyes wait for comprehension. Okay, so they just hang out there for a minute, right? Not in the middle of the sentence, right? Not on the longer words, right? Whereas the low-level reader was really challenged by so many of the words, right? So very long fixation times and a lot of rereading. What was the low-level reader rereading for? Did we see them reread at the end of the sentences? Does anybody remember? So we saw quite a bit of rereading.
So I have that Jen says they seem to be rereading the longer words.
Yeah, so they're rereading the longer words and they're rereading the text before the longer words.
Right. And someone says they seem to be rereading for comprehension through rereading through the whole sentence. And there was a question, are they trying to extract meaning?
Right. So after they've gone through and they've some sort of identified the words, then they're going to go back and reread. But we often saw regressions from those long words before they get to the end of the sentence. And when that's happening, they're using context to try to guess what the word is, right? They do a little decoding. They're not very good at it. Then they go back to the beginning of the sentence and they try to guess what the word is, right?
That's what Jen has. She said they're over relying on context to support weak decoding as a question. So perfect.
Excellent. Excellent. Yeah, that is right on target, right? And we can thank Stanovich for that, right? That's one of the giants, right? Keith Stanovich, finding out that poor readers rely on context for word recognition much more than skilled readers do, right? Okay, good. So how does this information that the reading speed of poor readers is limited by slow and inaccurate word recognition, how does that add to your understanding of reading fluency problems or comprehension problems? So let's unpack that a little bit. So based on what you see here, would you think that it would be an effective intervention to do something like read naturally, where children read the passages again and again and are just supplied the words? In terms of effective for improving their reading of that passage, yes. In terms of improving their reading for other passages, no, because they need the time to decode those words. And as long as the words are being supplied to them, They don't really get that practice, right? So this is a problem. Now, it's a little bit easier to think about what's the impact of this on understanding comprehension problems. Why would this low-level reader have a hard time comprehending? What they read?
They're using all their brain power to decode, Courtney says.
They are using all their brain power, right? And to decode, but really they're not very good decoders, right? So they're using all their brain power to guess. And guessing, all of those strategies for predicting what words are, those are all energy intensive, right? Energy intensive strategies. So they're spending so much time working at the superficial level of the text rather than just being able to snap those words up and then string them together in their linguistic networks. Okay, very nice, very nice. So now let's talk a little bit about how this information that you just saw could impact your reading instruction. Sometimes people who haven't seen this are really concerned when readers who are learning to decode do not understand what they're reading. You ever had this experience? I'll have teachers say to me, you know, well, when they're reading this leveled text, they seem to really understand what's going on. But when I give them this decodable, it's hard for them to comprehend. It's like they're not comprehending. So what we saw here with the low-level reader is that when the child is decoding, that's what their attention is on, right? Their attention is on the decoding. And so this is part of their process of becoming faster and more automatic decoders, right? When I started knitting, I would knit very slowly, right? It was a super focused activity. I never learned how to knit, so full disclosure, but so it's still super slow. All right, I never got any better at it. But people who knit a lot, they go through that slow phase and then they get faster, right? So I'm not sure if you want to be concerned that the child who's reading the decodable text may not be comprehending right at that moment as they're reading, okay? Because they might not be poor comprehenders. They might just not have the bandwidth right then to engage their normal comprehension processes. So how could you check that out? If they are poor comprehenders, then when you read them that text, they will not understand what you're reading to them. Okay. But if they just don't have the bandwidth because they're focusing on decoding, all right, you can prompt them to read that sentence again and give them the opportunity to recognize those words more easily, right? And to free up some of that energy so that they can comprehend what they just read. All right, so now we're going to talk a little bit about how you might be able to help them read more fluently and how you might be able to help them comprehend the text better. Okay, so comprehension and reading fluency, they both flow from accurate and easy word reading. Okay, and we know that accurate comes first. So you are going to teach the skills, of course, that support accurate word reading. That's no news. But then the second point here is you need to give them opportunities to do that slow and accurate decoding and have that be okay. They are not going to be fast right out of the gate. It is okay. Slow and awkward is a perfectly acceptable phase, right? And you want to give them some feedback as they're reading that decodable text themselves, right? you can recognize that when decoding is effortful, or if it's inaccurate, that you might not have comprehension on the first read. Okay, they just might not have that bandwidth. So you encourage the slow readers to reread each sentence. With some children, even I'll go back, like I'll have just a number, like so-and-so can recognize the word again if I have them reread after 3 words or after 4 words, right? Or after the phrase, right? So they're reading for accuracy first, then they're rereading for meaning. And so you might not want to expect it to all come together into one package right away. It might take some time to have that happen. All right, so that was our slow little entry. We talked about why struggling readers struggle, because they struggle with the word recognition piece, most of them, right? So now let's look at what differences in brain activity between the struggling and the skilled readers tell us about how to focus instruction. All right, here's a little house tour of the brain, because this gets confusing. So many brain talks, so many brain pictures, okay? So here's a picture that's from DeHaan's book, and you've seen it in many talks. These are the areas of the brain that are active during reading, meaning from recognizing the words all the way through to comprehending. And in fact, the areas are even more widespread than this. They're also in the right hemisphere. The whole brain is active when we're reading, okay? I don't find that to be particularly helpful, because it looks at the reading piece and the language piece all together, which is fine from a holistic perspective, but it doesn't help us think about what is the brain doing during that difficult piece of word recognition. But Sally Shaywitz did look at that quite a bit with fMRI, and these are the 3 areas she identified that are active when recognizing words. Okay, so, all right, so we've got the frontal area. This is the production area, speech production area, the visual word form area here in the back, and then the letter sound area here that's active during letter sound associations. So what's important to know is that these are the areas that are active when children are reading words, and also when adult skilled readers are reading words. Okay, these areas. In fact, right at the front end of skilled word recognition, right at the beginning, we've got 2 areas of the brain that are active. Our frontal speech production area, and this is silent reading. So they're not naming the word or anything like that. This is silent reading. The speech production area is active, and the visual word form area. Both areas active at the same time, right at the start of word recognition, which is super interesting. Because if reading was just a process of recognizing whole words that we memorized, you might think that this would be the only area that would be active. But instead, we've got both this visual area and the speech sound area. So the visual word form area is an area in charge of processing orthography. And the speech sound area is the area that processes phonology. So those brain pictures I showed you, that evidence was from MEG studies, these brain mapping studies, right? But we also have evidence from eye movement studies and brain wave studies, ERP studies, all converging on the same thing, early activation of phonology and orthography at the same time, right at the front end of word recognition. So we need to have both of these areas up and running, because ultimately, for reading expertise, you're going to need to link phonology and orthography. So now that we've looked at the endpoint with skilled readers, let's spend a little bit of time talking about how we get there. How do you get that cooperation between brain areas? Okay, so let's look at how the reading networks develop in beginning readers. Okay, this seems like a pretty good intuition. The visual word form area, probably people memorize a bunch of words first, and then that helps them read fluently, right? And helps build these other networks. Well, let's see if that's what happens. So when a non-reader arrives at school, all they have is speech sounds because they can speak, right? So they've got activation in this production area. Okay. Maybe they have a couple letter sounds, like maybe they know the first letter in their name, right? Or some basic words. They've got a couple letter sounds. They've got the speech sound area. Now, kindergarten to grade 2, what's happening? What's happening is they're deepening their understanding, their awareness of the speech sounds and words, right? Through phonemic awareness and through early reading. They're bringing online that area for letter sound activation. And they're connecting those two areas. And we call this the phonological network. This is the decoding network, the connection between speech sounds and letters and sounds. And as they start to do this, okay, they map some words, they recognize them more quickly the next time and the time after that, and those words start to get stored in the visual word form area. So what the research tells us is that by age 7, it's not the activity back here, it's the activity in this decoding network that is the best predictor of reading skill. If you have strong activity in this decoding network, that is going to go with being the better readers. Kids who have weak activity in this network are going to be the poor readers. This is age 7, right? So we're talking about like grade 2. Okay. Then look what's happening by age 10. By age 10, we still have this root active, but now the visual word form area is going to be the best predictor of reading skill. So to recap, early at age 7 is when the decoding network forms. That's the first network to form. And think about that. As you can decode words, you're forming very accurate memories for those words, right? And as you're forming those accurate memories, those memories are getting stored in the visual word form area. And as you're exposed to more and more text and you do more and more decoding and more reading, you store more and more word forms. And by the time you're 10, now this is way after the onset of reading fluency, right? Way after that, okay? By the time you're 10, the visual word form area becomes the strongest predictor of reading skill. So what do you need? You need decoding that's accurate and easy, and you need a lot of text exposure. When you have those two things together, you're going to be beefing up that visual word form area. So the decoding network is the earliest predictor of reading skill. And it looks like what's happening is that decoding enables efficient word recognition, and the efficient word recognition helps store those words in the visual word form area. And then that area becomes fully active and online by age 10 on average. So that's a lot. I'm going to add one more piece to it. Okay, so sometimes this can be like too much dessert. So just breathe, right? And convince yourself you've got that extra stomach. You can do one more. Now we're going to look at the difference between struggling readers and good readers. Okay, in terms of their pattern of brain activity. Okay, how do their reading networks differ? Okay, so on the left here, we've got proficient readers. On the right here, we've got struggling readers. And these are imaging data mostly from children. So we have the proficient readers. Look at this, everything's online. We've got activity in the speech sound area. We've got activity in the letter sound area. We've got activity in the visual word form area. And look what's happening with the struggling readers. We have inefficient overactivation in the frontal area, the speech sound area. It's inefficient, it's slow, it's not automatic. We have incomplete letter sound correspondences, right? That are not yet quite, they're not complete. They don't know all the patterns, or they know all the patterns some of the time, right? We've all seen that. And we have underactivation in the visual word form area. So struggling readers show less posterior activation than do skilled readers because they have not built this automatic decoding route. And as a consequence of that, they have some words that they've learned, but they're not mapping all the words that they see. And they're not reading as much as other children. And so they have underactivation in this visual word form area. And so this pattern of less activation in the posterior areas is the pattern that's characteristic of dyslexic readers and all readers who struggle with code-based skills. So let's now bring together the eye movements and the reading and think about the eye movements of that proficient reader as you look at all these areas, the phonology and the orthography, everything coordinating together, humming along, right? Working very efficiently. And then think about the eye movements of that low-level reader you saw, where they're struggling to decode, right? Few of the words are recognized automatically. So an inefficient decoding network actually undermines the development of automatic word recognition. Okay. And that inefficient decoding network is, in the science of reading, we talk about that as the phonological deficit, right? That core deficit, it's not the only deficit, but the core deficit that code-based struggling readers seem to really share, right? So this creates a problem because guess what? They have a phonological deficit. So it's not like they can learn phonics real easily. And so what happens to them early on? Teachers are like, you know, and it makes sense. He's not learning phonics. I'm going to teach him with sight words. I'm going to teach him with those index cards, right? But we know that that's not how the brain works. You might be able to get a quick boost by teaching them some high frequency words, but those high frequency word memories will not stay with them because they are not mapped. They don't have a very clear, precise memory of those words. So in the long run, it will not work very well. So inefficient decoding leading to poor word recognition is exactly what you saw in the eye movement record, with all of those regressions and all of those long fixations. Okay, so to get efficient reading, expert reading, you've got to build both networks, the phonological network and the orthographic network, and you need to get them to cooperate with each other. So the most effective interventions for struggling readers are going to focus on building those early decoding networks. And as you all know, building the early decoding network is not pretty. They are at times so slow, right? But that's okay. It's part of their process. It's okay, right? As long as they're reading accurately. So at the present time, we have no alternative path for teaching children to read. There's no plan B that leads them to become an efficient reader. Okay, so you have to work through the phonological deficit by doing phonemic awareness, right? By emphasizing the alphabetic principle, working on decoding, everything you can to strengthen phonological processing, because you just are not going to be able to get around it, not from what we currently know in terms of how reading brains develop. And no surprise, here are the key activities, right, that are going to build the phonological and orthographic networks. And I threw in letter writing here because this is often overlooked. Letter writing is so important. I have a little surprise slide here. All right, so Karen James at the University of Indiana does some wonderful work looking at children learning to write manuscript letters. Okay, and there's two things here I want you to see. So this is from a 2016 study they did. Children who are 4 to 6 years old, okay, and they either spend 4 weeks with handwriting practice or 4 weeks of drawing practice. Okay, they put them in the scanner and they have them look at letters, because they're only 4 to 6 years old, right? A bunch of them are not reading it. They have them just look at letters and look where you see the activation. In the frontal area, Broca's area, the speech sound area, crazy, huh? And this visual word form area in the back. So learning to write letters is starting that cooperation between those two roots. Okay, especially if you can teach them how to write their letters and say the sound at the same time, right? You're bringing those right together, okay? And now you're on like your fourth dessert. You're like, please, no, I do not want, it's chocolate mousse, but I still don't want any. But I have to just mention this because when you're teaching handwriting, there's so many different ways to do it. And a lot of times we use these sheets where they trace first. And what's interesting is if you have the child trace, that's interesting practice for them. They get an idea of the shape and it probably has its place. But I've also seen those handwriting pages that have nothing but the letter to trace, right? Look what happens if you ask them to copy instead of trace. You get some crazy stuff the first time, you get some crazy stuff the second time, but look what you get the third time, because they're generating it, right? Look at the S, look at the copying of the S. Backwards and something, ooh, a little bit better here, okay? And then finally they get that form down. So the importance of not only having them trace, but also figure out that form for themselves by doing the copying and then eventually going to straight memory where they cover it up. All right, so there are so many people's ideas in this presentation and very few of them are mine. I tend to knit them together, all right, but these are all the people that I'm very thankful to for influencing me. So I really appreciate your attention. It's so late. I'm happy to take questions if you have some. How's the chat looking, Rebecca?
We do have a few questions. So I wrote them down. We had two particular. One asks about vision therapy. Can you talk a little bit about that for reading remediation?
Yep. So vision therapy has its place for children who have visual ocular motor control problems. People should know that those are very, very low incidence in the population, very low, like single digit, as opposed to reading difficulties, which are more like very, very widespread, right? So it is not a method for addressing reading difficulties. And you don't have to take it from me. You can take it from the American Academy of Pediatrics, which has issued a statement every 10 years for the last 30 years, saying, please do not do vision therapy in order to address reading difficulties. Reading difficulties are language-based, because reading is not primarily a visual act, it is primarily a linguistic act. And what you're doing is there's an opportunity cost there, right? When parents invest in that, then they're not investing in some other intervention that could be more effective if it was dealing directly with the reading piece. So not recommended.
Right, and we have another question. There was a curiosity about whether you've done any studies on the eye movements of struggling readers after they've received evidence-based interventions.
Wouldn't that be a great study? That would be so great. That is something I look forward to doing. We do not have that data right now. And there's a lot. We do have fMRI data, oddly enough, because you can get big money to do those studies. And we find that the networks normalize. So it goes from more activation in the right hemisphere as well as the left for struggling readers to more activation in those key areas, especially the speech sound area on the left side once they've received intervention. But in terms of eye movement studies, we do not have that yet. That's a great idea.
I'm trying to fix my screen here. Just a second, I lost my little technology glitch on my end here. At this point, I have no more questions in the chat. Are you okay with any questions that they have, just opening their mic?
Sure.
Yeah. All right.
Yeah.
Anybody have any questions to ask Dr. Ashby at this point? Francesca.
A little bit off track. I mean, I'm just trying to put it together. One of the things I've heard about in the past is like crossing the midline and tracking. And I've noticed that I have kids who they do the one finger on the left page and then the right finger on the right page, and they don't cross the midline. Does that have anything to do with this, or is it valid, or is it something that I should correct? Or do you understand?
Yeah.
Okay.
I do understand the question, and I think there's that whole, isn't that part of the brain gym premise? Is they provide kids with a bunch of exercises for crossing the midline, et cetera. And I have to say, I'll say right up front, not my area of expertise. But remember that the right hand is controlled by the left side of the brain. So whenever a child is pointing, you want them to point, and they're right-hander, you want them to point with their right hand. Okay. The other thing we know is that attention is elevated in the area between the hands. Okay. So I have this particular little boy that I tutor, and he used to do this when I saw him. Let's see if I can make it happen here on the screen. It's like, he used to do like this. No. Hand. And then their attention is right in between the two hands. And so that's something that's actually surprisingly helpful. Thanks for the question.
I love that, because our we have these sit tall, and one of our others is two hands on text.
Two hands on text, yes, that's right.
Like you're securing yourself. So I just love that, just affirming some of the, maybe that intuition was right.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. Yeah.
I think I saw something else. Oh, nothing. I don't see anything else in there. I'm appreciating, I do want to say I appreciated the brain activity with the handwriting. How fascinating is that to see those areas that the brain affirming that for us?
Yeah. Yeah. Isn't that interesting? Her work is
Yeah.
really
Mhm.
is really fascinating. So this is more of a sort of why talk than a what talk, right? So hopefully when you go back to your practice, you can make some of those connections about like why this is happening, why this is working, or why this is not working.
Well, I want to just thank you for your time, Dr. Ashby, and thank you for your everyone's engagement and active participation. You will find this on our website in about a week or so. We clean up the recording and any mistakes I've made on my end of tech. So thank you so much for supporting the Reading League Michigan and the Reading League as a whole. And yes, thank you, Dr. Ashby, for just all you bring to the field and your just genuine, authentic kindness and your friendship with the Reading League Michigan.
Well, thank you, Rebecca. It's been a great opportunity. And now I'm seeing all these names. I'm seeing some people I know. So that's wonderful. Thank you all for your questions and participating. Be well.
Thank you all. Good night.
Good night.